Welcome to Conversations in World History. I'm so happy to have on Professor Jonathan Reynolds of Northern Kentucky University. Jonathan was the previous president of the World History Association. He's a professor of African history, a winner of an Excellence in Teaching Award, and the author of a multitude of books, including one of my favorites, Sovereignty and Struggle, Africa in the Era of the Cold War, which we talked about in one of my first podcast episodes. Jonathan and his co-author Eric Gilbert, with whom he's written a bunch before, are coming out with a new world history textbook, and I can't wait to read it because Jonathan is a really smart and cool dude. That is how he would write in his textbook, because Jonathan is a blast to talk with and super fun to read. He's just got a way of making history interesting, thought-provoking, provocative, and there's just a wealth of knowledge that comes out of our discussion today about various independence movements in Africa. We talked about, I think, 5 different countries, and I wish we could have just kept talking, because it is really fun and informative to speak with Jonathan, and I'll have him back on here again. Hope you enjoy the episode. Hey, Jonathan.
Hey, how you doing?
Good. How are you?
Not too bad, not too bad.
Let's get to it. So,
Yeah, let's go. Get
our
off my
first-
notes, Cat.
Our episode we talked about last time was on Africa and the Cold War, which was really fun to listen to again after I think a year or two that I hadn't heard it. And I'm just in the midst of teaching African independence movements, which is one of my favorite topics, but I feel like I never really do it justice. I try to give the students a wide array of different countries, different ways that Africans went about getting their independence. It's a lot to keep track of. I thought this would be a fun way to look at it with my students, not only to publish the podcast, but also to use this with my class.
Yeah.
So I selected, I think, about six or seven countries. We'll try to do them a few minutes each. Just kind of the big picture. What happened? What should everybody know about this particular country and their road to independence? Okay.
Oh, okay.
And we're gonna skip over probably the most famous and I don't know if we can say most important one, which was Ghana, right? Which was 1957, because that one I at least spend so much time on in my class, and I want to hit on a bunch of others beyond that. So let's start with a few French colonies. Let's
Okay.
begin with Algeria.
Oh,
Okay.
begin with Algeria. That's an interesting one.
Okay, well, tell me why that's interesting to start
Well,
with.
well, I
Algeria.
was thinking we might do it chronologically, but it's in many ways makes sense to start with Algeria, so we can do that.
Okay.
Because so much of what happens in Algeria is kind of like background and stage setting for what's going to happen in other places.
Right.
So I think when you're talking about Algeria, one of the first things you have to do is bring in the impact of European notions of race and sort of sophistication or civilization or things like that. Because when you look at decolonization movements following World War II, and those are, of course, global, they're not just happening in Africa.
Right.
But North African states, like Middle Eastern states, get their independence pretty darn quickly at the end of World War II. And at the end of World War II, it's certainly not clear, at least from the perspective of the British, the French, the Belgians, or the Portuguese, that African states are going to get their independence anytime soon. Right? The British and French are saying, yes, independence may come hundreds of years from now, decades from now. And what that independence looks like, we have no idea now. But for North Africa, they're kind of like, okay, you folks are kind of Arabs, and you're kind of white. And if you back up at various, European constructions of whiteness, a lot of those early 20th century constructions included Arabs in that rubric of whiteness.
Yeah. Well,
And so,
and actually in the United States racial categories, Arabs are counted as white.
right,
Oh,
exactly.
yeah.
Um, and so, Libya gets its independence quite quickly. And Egypt is already kind of quasi independent, so it gets a bit more independent in 1952. But in Algeria, the answer is no. Because Algeria belongs to a whole special category of colonial states, and that is it's a settler colony.
Mm.
And by the time we get to the end of World War II, there are millions of French people in Algeria. I mean, Algeria is initially invaded by the French in 1840. Its pacification is declared complete in 1870, which means there's 30 years of unending warfare suppressing Algerian independence. And then, in particular, World War II, and I love this because it turns contemporary sort of immigration issues on its head. When the Germans invade France in 1941, millions of French flee to Algeria.
And to Morocco, right?
North Africa in general, yes.
Which is Casablanca.
Right, exactly. So there's massive European refugee migrant flight to Algeria.
So then the Europeans are more reluctant to give it up, the French.
Yes, and that's because being a settler in a settler colony is almost always a great deal.
Mm.
And this, the French in Algeria are called the Pied Noir, the Blackfeet. Nobody knows why they're called that, but they hold positions of economic, political, and racial privilege, and that's a good deal. And they don't want to give it up. And France also doesn't want to give up Algeria because Algeria is very nice. It's got really great cropland in the north. The environment is really great. It's strategic. And so the French are arguing that Algeria is just a province of France that happens to be on the other side of the Mediterranean Ocean and also happens to have lots of Algerians in it who are not yet French enough to have full French rights.
And my understanding is that Algeria is an example of war for independence in Africa.
Oh, totally. Yes.
Right.
Yes.
This is the Battle of Algiers movie, the
right.
National Liberation Front. What should people know about that?
Well, it starts in the case of Algeria in 1945 with the end of the war, when you see the first agitations for not necessarily independence. There's some of that, but there's also agitation in Algeria just for Algerians to be extended more rights because French subjects who are not French enough, that can be racially, culturally, whatever, are subject to a system of law called the indigenat. And that is basically an extra mean version of the law. It involves lots of corporal punishment, less rights to trial by jury. You're not protected by the French Constitution, things like that. And lots of people begin demonstrating, saying, hey, war's over. We fought against fascists who are racist and horrible people. And so time for France to be less racist and less fascist too. And you should do that by extending us rights. And one of the first responses of this is that a number of French citizens living in Algeria, it's always tricky using the term settlers because it's so politically loaded, but the white French people living in Algeria immediately form militias and attack a number of these demonstrations. And shoot Algerians who are protesting for more rights under the French Constitution. And to speed that up, you get a series of sort of tit-for-tat attacks in the late 1940s and early 1950s, and that eventually results in the formation of the National Liberation Front,
And a full-scale independence war.
which quickly shifts over into a war for independence, which is not big armies. It's not the Algerian FLN fighting against the French. It's many actually. FLN is make sure I'm getting my acronyms right. Yeah, Front Liberation National. Is a coalition of a whole bunch of groups, some of which are more radical and some of which are less radical. But over the course of the 1950s, this escalates into what is a catastrophic civil war.
Yeah.
In Algeria. And this is often called the Battle of Algiers because in Algiers, every single day, bombs are going off around the city and one group is assassinating members of other groups. And, there might be street battles between guerrillas or their, attacks in government offices. It's brutal. It's mind-bogglingly bad.
And so my understanding is at this point, France's experience with Algeria really influences how they want to relate to the other colonies that they have in Africa. And they develop a couple of different strategies over time. They tried the French Union. They tried something called Loi Cadre. I don't know.
Loi Cadre. That's the kinder, gentler version of the Indigenat.
Okay.
Extending more sort of civil rights and a bit more representation to more people. And it's important to keep in mind that the French system of administration, it's what we generally call direct rule, is built upon an ideal of assimilation. And the sort of the carrot that the French always used for colonized peoples was that if you get French enough, if you become what they call evolved, if you evolve enough culturally, you'll become a French citizen.
So that's the French Union, where they're seeing all of their colonies as part of France.
And eventually all these colonized people will be French citizens once they get French enough. And there are thousands and thousands, probably tens of thousands of Algerians by the time you get to the 1950s who are French citizens and who can vote and who aren't subject to the Indigenat or the Loi Cadre. And so, and some of those Algerians fight on the side of the French.
Yeah.
The Harkis, hundreds of thousands of Algerians are fighting on the side of the French, and that's why it's a civil war. It's not just a war of liberation, and that's why it's so mind-bogglingly bad. This is the same thing about the American Revolution, of course.
This is the complexity I love in history.
Oh my
never
gosh,
simple. It's never simple.
And you can't talk about Algeria without pointing out that the same thing's going on in Vietnam. At the same time, and
which is still a French colony at that point.
Still a French colony, and the French are fighting against a somewhat differently organized revolutionary movement. Although it's important to also bring in that the FLN starts getting Soviet support in the mid-1950s. So this is also cast as a war between democracy and communism, as well, despite the fact that a lot of the French government is also communist at this time. So it's also so complicated. But it's important to keep in mind that France, and when we get to some British colonies here, France and Britain are stretched to the gills. I mean, they're both completely broke. They're both completely exhausted by World War II. Their faith in their own institutions has been shaken to their foundations, and trying to maintain an empire, or at least parts of an empire, is really more than France and Britain can manage. At this point, they are no longer the global powers that they used to. And, for France, Vietnam and Algeria are sort of like, they say, these are the hills on which we will die. And then in the end, they're like, oh no, we lose. Which is what happens eventually in Algeria.
So the Loi Cadre, they're trying to give some more local autonomy to places after attempting the Greater France. And then in 58, de Gaulle offers colonies the chance to join the French community and maintain these economic ties, or to get complete independence with no aid.
Exactly.
He really doesn't want, I think, the second option.
That's right.
And that brings us to Guinea. That brings us to
Yeah.
Guinea. What's
Yeah.
special about Guinea's story?
Okay, and I want to just throw in
Sure.
hopefully as a transition point. That 1958 referendum is driven by what's happening in Algeria. And the French Fourth Republic collapses because of the failure to reach any kind of military in Algeria, any kind of military solution. And de Gaulle is brought back in. And the French conservatives think de Gaulle, the hero of World War II, is going to, go into Algeria guns blazing and teach the Algerians a thing or two. And he looks at the situation and says, look, France can't win. So let's have a vote and ask whether or not countries want to stay as part of some sort of French union, some sort of, French equivalent of the Commonwealth or something, a French community.
So what was going on in Algeria not only led to a change in the leader, but it actually led to the end of the entire governmental system, the Fourth Republic.
There you go.
And brings in the next one, which is what, the Fifth Republic?
Yeah.
Okay. So Algeria has a huge impact, not just on Africa, but on France as well.
Yeah, and again, it's dangerous about Algeria the entire time. But even after de Gaulle comes in and holds the referendum, when the Algerians vote no too, we hear that the only place that votes no, but the Algerians are like, hell no, we want out. And de Gaulle agrees. The sort of extreme right-wing factions within the French government, and in particular within the French military, say this is unacceptable. And in 1960, they launch an attempted coup to overthrow de Gaulle and the French government, which is shockingly put down through the brand new technological mechanism of television, where de Gaulle goes on TV and says there are planes flying from Algeria to Paris right now. The ultras, as they're called, the ultra conservatives, are going to overthrow French democracy. And the people of France need to stand up now to be prepared to repel them. And crowds hit the streets, and the ultras say, okay, we're out of here. And they back off. And that proceeds towards then Algerian independence, during which, by the way, we also must remember the French are nuking Algeria at this time.
Doing tests of...
They're doing nuclear tests in the Algerian Sahara, which is a subtle statement to the Algerians. Or maybe not.
There's so many different pieces at play here between Vietnam and the Cold War and the nuclear weapons. All right, let's talk Guinea.
There you go. Sorry.
Sékou Touré, right?
Sékou Touré, yeah. Who's an interesting character. And he at least, his family lays claim to a sort of revolutionary heritage, in that he's descended from Sékou Touré is I'm losing it here.
Sure, no problem.
Samari Touré, who's famously fights against the expansion of French colonialism in that region of the West African Sudan in the 1880s. But he's relatively well educated, although, again, reputedly, he's thrown out of primary school for refusing to write essays about how benevolent French rule is. But he eventually manages to get trained as a telegraph operator. And in the late 1940s and early 1950s, he joins the French Communist Party and forms a trade union for these telegraph workers, which he manages to keep alive in the face of severe French antagonism. The French don't want trade unions. Most French don't. And then manages to expand that trade union to include pretty much all of the sort of monetized laborers in French infrastructure in Guinea. And this is important because Guinea is chock full of strategic resources. I mean, it's got lots and lots of gold. It's got lots and lots of really high grade iron. It's got lots and lots of diamonds. And there are all these things that the French really need. And so the French invest fairly heavily in extractive infrastructure in Guinea. So the French are building the mines now. Mind you, they're charging the Guineans for the money to build the mines, and they're building railroads, but the Guineans have to pay for the railroads.
Right.
It's everyone who's listening. Colonial powers did not pay for infrastructure in their colonies. The colonies had to pay for the infrastructure through loans from banks in France. Anyway, so there's a significant infrastructure which is built to extract all these strategic elements. But infrastructure and the people who run the infrastructure are hard to control from afar. And I think it's 1956, Sékou Touré organizes the longest running trade union strike in French Africa. And it basically shuts down the rail system, it shuts down the communication system, it shuts down the mines for over 2 months. And this propels him not just to fame in the region of Guinea itself, but all across Francophone Africa, and really in Anglophone and Portuguese Africa too. He becomes really famous.
Let me ask you a quick question here, and I'll bring in Nkrumah from Ghana for a second. Did these leaders know of Gandhi's work in India, and were they influenced by him?
Oh, of course. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, and again, you're dealing with people who are really plugged in to systems of communicate and use. And so, they're absolutely familiar of, the Indian African National Union. And, it's nonviolent resistance, it's economic resistance, it's mass marches, just like, African Americans in the United States are deeply influenced by this nonviolent resistance.
So Sékou Touré does some really incredible economic nonviolent resistance and shutting down the economy to some extent. What happens when France gives the offer of joining the French community to its colonies?
Almost everybody, aside from the Algerians, as we already mentioned, and aside from the Guineans, votes we will stay in some sort of relationship, economic, cultural, and political, with France. And it's
for my students who don't speak French, we is yes, right?
Yes okay. Or no, with that French accent. Oh, yes. No. And again, the French are working really hard in the 1950s to try and get more people on board with this sort of kinder, gentler colonialism kind of approach. And they are making concessions. They're extending sort of more rights to people. And this is also tied up again with a battle going on in France. The French Communist Party briefly controls the National Assembly post-World War II. And while the communists are in charge, they say, we're going to extend French citizenship to everyone in every French colony in the world. Full French rights. And fun, if you think about this, what that means is that the communists are saying, we're going to live up to the brotherhood, to the ideals of the French Revolution, liberty, égalité, fraternity. That's liberty, equality, and brotherhood, by making everybody French, and of course, everybody else in the French political spectrum, including the socialists, are like, "Oh no, that's too much. People are," and if we do that, the colonies will control France, right? That they'll become the majority. And so the socialists and the conservatives center right, in France are trying to figure out ways to get people on board without giving them too much. But so famously in Guinea, led by these very powerful and very successful now trade unions, because they get a lot of concessions from the French in 56. Mm-hmm. They get a lot more money, they get a lot more pay, they get a lot more rights. Guinea votes no. And the French totally bring the hammer down. The French say, okay, you get your independence, but while we're packing up to leave, we're going to do as much damage to the infrastructure of the state as we possibly can. And, you know, they burn the census records. They smash the switching equipment in the railroads. They smash the fine china in the governor's mansion. And reputedly, they remove all the light bulbs from the sockets.
Yeah, we actually mentioned this briefly in our first podcast episode a couple years ago, and when you described it, I said it sounds like a bad breakup. They just smashing everything on the way out. That's incredible. So Guinea must have been really crippled at that point. So just briefly before we move on to Senegal, what does Guinea do? They don't have the economic ties to France anymore, who they had relied on for so long. Well, not relied on, that's the bad term, but they had been maybe somewhat forcefully dependent on France during the colonial period. So they must have needed some kind of economic.
Yeah. Well, they got to have hard currency. And it's an important point, again, for all you students and listeners out there, that there's only some kinds of money in the world that work, right? And Guinea can announce that it has a currency, but nobody will take it. You know, they can't buy anything from the United States with a Ghanaian currency. They can't buy anything from the Soviet Union with a Ghanaian currency. You have to have, at this time, you have to have francs, you have to have pounds sterling, or you have to have dollars if you want to buy anything. And so they've just been cut off from all the francs. So they've got to find somebody who's going to buy their stuff and pay them with a different hard currency. And they desperately want the United States to buy things from them. And the United States is pretty happy to do that. But the two main states that come to the rescue of Guinea initially are the Soviet Union, which immediately sends in technicians to rebuild the roads and put light bulbs back in the sockets, or at least bring the light bulbs to put in the sockets. But it's also Ghana. Mm-hmm. And we're not going to talk about Ghana, but Ghana comes into independence in 1957 in a very unusual situation for any colony anywhere in the world, in that it has foreign currency reserves. Ghana had been so wealthy, so productive as a colony, that it actually had money in the bank on independence. And one of the things people complain about Kwame Nkrumah about is that he bankrupts Ghana. By about 1960, all Ghana's foreign currency reserves has been spent. And that's true. But he does that in part by sending hard currency to Guinea. So Guinea can, keep things running. I believe Ghana pays the salaries of all Ghanaian civil servants for the first year that Guinea is independent.
So that really falls within his Pan-Africanist.
Totally. He spends some of his money on jet airliners and things like that, but he also spends a huge amount of it on building up Pan-African relationships and infrastructure and identity.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's move on to Senegal. The reason I wanted to talk about Senegal is I'm fascinated with Leopold Senghor and the idea of a poet prime minister. So what should everybody know about Senegal and Senegalese independence and Leopold Senghor?
Okay, well, one of the things about Senegal is that Senegal is the place where things go mostly as the French have planned. And part of that is that Senegal, which had been a French African colony with more French colonial influence, than most other places, was a spot where this French policy of assimilation had been pretty successful. Senegal has probably the largest concentration of French citizens who are African citizens of France than any other French colony. Somebody will probably fact check me on that, but I'm kind of guessing that that's what it is. And to try and go faster here, Leopold Senghor is the perfect example of that as far as the French are concerned. Now, he had gained full citizenship in the late 1940s, I think, and he had fought for France in World War II, which is another element in this. But he's Christian. He is he's not just literate in French. He is a poet of national reputation in France. And so the French hold him up as this perfect example of what Africans can become through the benevolent influence of France. And Senegal,
is that what you meant by French enough? We didn't really dissect that. Did you mean in terms of religion, in terms of fluency in French language?
All the things, and there's not a set of check boxes.
Ability to cook Julia Child recipes.
Oh, you gotta eat French.
Yeah.
You got to eat French.
Okay.
You have to dress French. You have to sound French. You have to love France. And the trick for Senghor is he does all these things and he gets all the rights, and then he leads the process of independence in Senegal. And then he sort of comes out as somebody who identifies not first and foremost as French, but as someone who identifies first and foremost as Black, because he's a leading exponent of a philosophy known as negritude, which is blackness. And the French are like, you double crossed us. We thought you were totally French. And he's like, no, sorry, I'm Black first. Yeah. And Senegalese second. And maybe somewhere down the list, I'm French too.
And negritude would be kind of like a Black pride artistic movement that's actually transcontinental, right? Because you have some transatlantic, you have some Caribbean and writers who also now I actually I read with my students a negritude poem, something masks. Where he discusses, it's a beautiful poem about masks, and we try to analyze what masks represent in the poem.
That's right. I think they represent identities, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's an important thing to keep in mind that, through almost all of human history, human beings didn't think of themselves as Black or white or Asian or Hispanic or anything like that. Really, probably white people are the first people to develop what we think of as a racial identity. But Africans in the early 20th century certainly did not think of themselves as Black people. We could also talk for hours just about structures of identity and the malleability of identity. But by the mid 20th century, because of what's going on all over the world, and this is because of so much transatlantic communication between African Americans and Latino Americans and Luso Africans and West Africans and Central Africans, people are beginning to develop a sense of racial identity. Someday we'll have to talk about Afrobeat and Fela Kuti.
That's podcast number 3. Yeah, I remember that now that we had talked about doing that.
Yeah.
So Algeria, let's summarize the 3 French African colonies. Algeria gains its independence through war. Guinea gains its independence.
War of liberation, yeah.
Yeah. Guinea gains its independence by, when the French make that offer in 1958, they say, no, we don't want to stay part of the French community, so they're independent. What happens with Senegal? How did they gain their independence?
Well, 1960 is often called the year for Africa, when they hope big budget African countries. I'm supposed to know, but I can't remember exactly how many African countries get their independence in 1960. Maybe it's 17. This is
A
when the
lot.
wind.
I have a
Yeah,
map of it,
yeah,
and
it's when
my
the
students
winds of change
were
are
quick
blowing
to
across.
recognize 1960 as the big year.
Yeah. And what's fascinating actually is that initially it's not Senegal that gets its independence, it's the Mali Confederation,
Mm-hmm.
where Senegal and what is at that point called the French West African Sudan decide to get their independence together as a West African Confederation, the Mali Confederation. That does not last very long. And that is largely because Senegal has a lot more people. You wouldn't expect that, but it does. And a lot more money than Mali does. And the region of the Sudan is hoping for lots and lots of that sort of, we conservatives would call this wealth transfer, that Senegal is going to help develop Mali really quickly.
So
And
Senegal was part of that Mali Confederation
yes,
and got
yes, it's
independence through with them.
yes. It lasts about 2 months.
Okay.
And then breaks apart into the independent country of Mali and to Senegal.
But did they have to fight a war for that
No,
independence in 19?
there's not a war, although there is sort of a military standoff at
Okay.
the time between the two, and they arrest some members of the other people's political representatives, but then decide just to go their separate ways.
But
Uh,
I'm talking about when they get independence from France. How do they get the independence in 1960? Does France just kind of give up at that point?
at this point, this is following up with the oui or non vote, the yes or no vote. It's like, okay, you're independent, but you're part of the French Union. And
Hmm.
crucial to this, by the way, going back to hard currency, I'm not an economic historian, but man, I love to talk about currency. The CFA, the which is the currency of Francophone Africa, is backed by the franc.
Hmm.
So it is effectively a hard currency. It is linked to the franc and is convertible with francs. So Francophone Africa gets a hard currency, at, with but Algeria and Guinea don't. So this is one of the main things that the French offer. If you
Okay.
stick with us,
So they get the independence, but they're still part of that French community.
right, they're part of the French
Got it.
community, and they had the advantage of a pretty hard currency that's convertible.
Mhm.
But that also means that their economic fate is linked to France. And if France wants to turn off the CFA and say it's not convertible at any point, they can devastate those economies. So
Okay.
it comes with security, but less sovereignty. Uh,
Let's switch over to British East Africa.
okay,
Okay,
which country?
which do we talk about first, Kenya or Tanzania?
Um, Tanzania gets to independence sooner, but the struggle in some ways is more dramatic earlier in Kenya. So choices.
So let's talk about Kenya.
Okay, Kenya.
I know of Kenya, Jomo Kenyatta and the Mau Mau. What
Land and Freedom Party, we like to say.
Land and Freedom Party?
Yeah.
Okay, so explain this all to us.
Okay, well, let's back up again
Okay.
and once again go back the same way we did with Algeria. And we have to recognize that Kenya is, in many ways, a settler colony. And settler colonies are always complicated, and they almost never get to independence peacefully.
Mm.
Now, Kenya is not a settler colony in the way Algeria is, in that the white, in this case, British and Irish population of Kenya is tiny compared to that population, the population of French in Algeria. I'm going to hazard that maybe only a couple of percent, I should know these things, but maybe only a couple of percent of the population of Kenya under British colonialism are actually British citizens who
Mm-hmm.
have settled semi-permanently in the highlands of Kenya. And the reason for the highlands is the highlands are very, very nice, and there's no malaria there.
Mm.
And it's also, not only are they very, very nice, that's where the coffee and tea are grown.
Is that where Nairobi is?
Yes, Nairobi
Okay.
is also up in the highlands. And also, the highlands are high because they're volcanoes, and volcanoes, while a bummer, while they're going off, um, give you fabulous volcanic soil, which is
Mm.
what you need, by the way, to grow coffee. You need
Okay.
volcanic soil to grow really good coffee
Makes sense.
or tea.
Hawaii.
Yeah, there you
Hawaii,
go.
yeah.
Hawaii or the highlands of Brazil or Colombia, you name it, Sumatra,
Mm-hmm.
places that grow good coffee are volcanic. And once again, let's point out that coffee comes from the Rift Valley,
Mm.
mostly from Ethiopia, but right next door is
Oh,
Kenya.
sure,
So these
Ethiopian,
are
yeah.
these are places where coffee had been grown for thousands of years. But so what you have is a very small but very, very powerful group of British settlers who have moved into the highlands. And interestingly enough, in some settler colonies, particularly in Portuguese Africa and to a certain extent in France, there are lots of working class French or Portuguese who go to these places to get opportunities they can't get at home and to also get racial privilege that they can't get at home. In Kenya, it's largely sort of refugee British aristocracy.
Hmm.
That a lot of the British aristocracy are not having, if you've seen Downton Abbey,
I have.
they're not having the best century
Right.
in the early 20th century. You know, they're being displaced by industrial wealth and the
I don't know.
rise.
It still looks like a pretty good century when you're watching Downton Abbey, but yeah, maybe not as good as the one before. I'll
Right.
take I'll take that one. I'll take
But
that
they're,
century in that life.
yeah, but they're also losing their power because of the rise of
Right.
citizenship. That poor Brits aren't peasants anymore. They might be working class, but they're citizens, and you can't tell them what to do, and you can't beat them up, and things like that. And a lot of British aristocracy are like, oh, things just aren't like they used to be. Perhaps if I go to Kenya, I can live a proper aristocratic life where I can really tell the peasants what to do. And when they go to Kenya, what do they get? They get giant estates of land, um, where they can grow really valuable crops and
Hmm.
where they get to tell the inhabitants what to do. And that is grow tea for us or grow coffee for us.
And
And
have their house servants and
oh,
right
and
that they
all that
yeah.
stuff. Yes, all the
Hmm.
accoutrements that comes with the aristocratic privilege lifestyle. So what you've got here, by the way, is a group of very, very unhappy Africans, predominantly the Kikuyu, who
Yeah.
are the populations who had lived in the highlands of Ethiopia, who have lost their land.
That's the majority tribe
What
nation of
one of the
ethnic
largest
group.
ethnic
Yeah.
groups in that part of Kenya, at least in the
Okay.
um, and so and again, we're post World War II, and tens of thousands of Kenyans have fought in World War One and World War II on the side of the British. And they have paid huge amounts of taxes to support the British in the war on fascism. And they've been listening to British propaganda about how bad fascism is. And this applies across the continent, by the way. And at the end of World War II, a very large number of colonized people are like, colonialism sounds an awful lot like fascism. Um, and so if you guys are really about democracy and stuff, well, then you need to give us our independence and give us our land back. It's
Hmm.
also important, by the way, to contextualize this. The United States and Soviet Union are both saying that at the same time, too. So the new
Right.
dominant powers in the world are talking about how bad fascism and colonialism are.
Hmm.
So this leads to the creation of the Land and Freedom Party in the highlands of Ethiopia, who say, well, if you're not going to give us our land back and let us grow the coffee and make the money off the coffee on our land ourselves, we're going to start a guerrilla conflict against you. And that, on rare occasions, involved attacks on actual British settlers or colonial police departments or colonial officials. For the most part, it involved attacks on the infrastructure of farms, and, to make things more complicated, the Kikuyu who are living and working on those farms.
Mm-hmm. I actually have a New York Times article from that period describing an attack on a white settler family, uh, a doctor and the children. So it's interesting to get that context that that was pretty rare. I'm sure it was
Yeah, that's what makes the news in the
very
United
newsworthy,
States.
right?
Yeah, exactly. That's what makes
Yeah,
the news in the United States.
right.
But it's much more what the Land and Freedom Party does is tell all the people who are living on these British plantations, you guys need to stop working. You need to stop working. You know, you need to set fire to the coffee plants. You need to sabotage it. And these are the people who are caught between, you know, the oppressive colonial power and the fairly radical revolutionary movement that is trying to overthrow that colonial power and that settler state.
And who was Jomo Kenyatta, and where does he fall into all of this?
Jomo Kenyatta is an interesting dude. He comes from a pretty wealthy um, and privileged Kikuyu family, because not everybody's poor under colonialism. This is very important to keep in mind. Sekou Touré did okay, but Leopold Senghor came from a very wealthy family too.
Sure.
And that's where you get the education that helps propel you to a position of power. Jomo Kenyatta is a graduate student in anthropology. I think, is it Oxford or Cambridge or the University of London? It's one of those three. So he's off getting his PhD in anthropology, and famously writes an internal Kikuyu ethnography called Facing Mount Kenya. And so he is accused of being a supporter of the Land and Freedom Party, of Mau Mau, but he says, I'm not. That's not my thing. But he doesn't condemn it as vociferously as the British would like. So he eventually returns from Britain in the late 1950s after what the British call the Mau Mau emergency is largely resolved, by the way, through the use of brutal suppression and concentration camps.
I believe the British recently apologized for it, right?
For torture.
Yes,
for various forms of torture. Yes, castration, rape,
and not just I believe members of the guerrilla force, but just generally often members of the Kikuyu.
That's, you know, this is how you combat guerrilla movements, right? I'm not saying that's a good thing, but that's it. And it's also what, I'll get in all kinds of trouble for this. It's what guerrilla movements want the colonial power to do, to compete them, to try and compete with them, because that's the kind of thing that radicalizes more people and drives.
That makes sense.
Yeah, it's a cycle of violence that both sides are deeply invested in.
So could we say that Kenya is an interesting example of both violent and nonviolent protest happening at the same time, working separately, maybe together in some ways?
Oh, yeah, because not everybody in Kenya supports the Land and Freedom Party. It is largely a Kikuyu movement in the highlands, and other populations in Kenya have not had their lands taken away. They don't like the British, mostly, but they're radicalized by being, disappropriated from their homes and lands and having their labor extracted in a much more aggressive manner than elsewhere in the colonial system. Let's keep in mind, all colonial systems are oppressive. They are all, in fact, I would argue, totalitarian. But yeah, there's this mix. And Jomo Kenyatta in many ways represents that more moderate approach. And he presents himself to the British as, look, hey, I'm the guy who can oversee a peaceful transition to colonial to independence, which is what eventually happens with the Kenyan African National Party, which is a mass mobilized party, and they have strikes. right? All the African independent parties have strikes, and so they go on strike and they put economic pressure on the colonial power, and they say, "Look, we're going to make it so much more expensive for you to get the tea and coffee out. We're going to make it so much harder for you to make money selling us soap, whatever." And that again, the British are exhausted, and the British figure out that while they have repressed Mau Mau, it came at a significant cost.
Mm-hmm.
The British do not come out of that looking good, just like the French don't come out of Dien Bien Phu or the Battle of Algiers looking good. They looked like they're on that old side of oppressive anti-human rights, anti-democracy, which of course they were.
Yeah. Wow, there's so much going on here.
Boom.
Um,
Yeah.
let's skip Tanzania for the sake of time
Okay.
and go on to Congo.
Oh,
Okay,
Congo. That wasn't on my list. You threw me a curveball.
It wasn't on your list.
You threw me a curveball.
Sorry.
Oh, yeah. That's all right. I'm a trained professional.
Okay. All right. Well, I in college saw the movie Lumumba.
Oh, okay.
Did you ever see that one?
Yes. And I'm supposed to have watched recently. What is it? Soundtrack to a coup d'etat?
Oh, I don't know that.
Oh no, that's that we can come back to that when we talk about music sometime.
Okay. All right.
I've downloaded it, but I haven't watched it yet. But it's about the American jazz ambassadors during the Cold War and their role in the Congo during the Congo crisis.
Okay.
That's foreshadowing, ladies and gentlemen. Come back to hear about music.
Episode 3. So yeah, we got to do a trilogy. My kids are watching Star Wars these days, so trilogy is on my mind. Yeah. Okay, so Congo's such a fascinating story.
Oh my gosh,
it's so complex, but. Who was the colonizer? Who is Patrice Lumumba?
Okay, it's Belgium, and to paraphrase Mike Myers, it's those evil Belgians. In that, Belgium has a different approach to colonialism. In many ways, they're like the French direct rule, but they start out under Leopold as the Congo Free State, which is a charter company. So it's initially, and this is true for colonialism in many parts of the world, but more intensely in the Belgian Congo, that it is a corporate entity that colonizes Congo, subjugates the local states and peoples, and sets about extracting natural resources, mostly in the form of latex.
When you say corporate entity, do you mean a company like the British East India Company?
Yes, absolutely. Okay. By the way, there's just a host of fabulous new scholarship that's come out looking at charter companies and corporate states and how they blend statehood with corporatism. The British East India Company stuff, and I've got like 3 or 4 of these books stacked up.
My homeland of New York was a Dutch West India Company.
Well, that's crucial. That Americans think the United States starts with the Pilgrims. It does not. It starts with the Carolina Company. It starts with the New York Company. It starts with the Virginia Company. These are companies that have armies and that have the right to form treaties.
Right.
Other states. I mean, it's so fascinating. But anyway, so the Congo Free State, which is initially ceded to Leopold as his private property because he promises all the other colonial powers, all the other European imperialist powers at the Conference of Berlin, that he's going to create a Christian utopia. That's hence free state. He's going to end slavery and spread Christianity. And it's going to be so wonderful that everybody in the world is going to say, oh, those wonderful Europeans and their civilizing influence. And instead, to speed ahead here, because I know we're running over, within 30 years, probably on the order of 5 to 10 million people are dead.
And,
hundreds of thousands, if not millions, have had one hand or one foot or the other chopped off because their parents failed to meet their quota of extracting latex or sometimes palm oil.
Yeah.
And
The great popular history of this, and I had him on my podcast,
yeah,
Adam Hawkchild. We talked about
yeah,
his British anti-slavery book, but he wrote King Leopold's Ghost, which
that's exactly right about the
yeah.
whole red rubber scandal. Bad that the other colonial powers, even the French and the British and the Portuguese, are like, oh no, dude, you can't do that. You're making us look bad, and you told us you were going to make us look good.
Yeah.
And so, following, the red rubber scandal, the Belgians get less evil. They don't get benevolent, and they establish a system of direct rule in the region, which is somewhat more oppressive even than the French. Pretty much nobody who is Congolese is allowed to get an education beyond primary school. And so it's a place where only Belgians are educated and only Belgians have positions of any kind of authority. If there's, and we'll use this as a transition, I think, if there's a brewery, and there are always breweries, it's about the only thing that colonial powers will build in a colony is a brewery, and a cigarette factory, by the way, because those are guaranteed to make money. But Lumumba is one of the tiny minority of Congolese who managed to get what we would think of as a secondary education. And he starts out actually getting to work in the postal service. And then later on, he gets to help manage a brewery. But the Belgians, along with the Portuguese, are the European colonial powers who basically say, no, there's not going to be independence. That, Congo will always be Belgian, and it will always be wonderful and happy because of our incredibly benevolent influence. And this lasts up until 1958. And that's tied up with this yes or no vote, which the Congolese very much know is happening, right? That even France is giving people a choice as to whether or not they want to be part of France. And so in 1958...
And the Belgian colony is also a French-speaking
right? Exactly.
So they're really tied into that.
That much easier to get the information. That's exactly right. And in 1958, coming as a total shock to the Belgians and not to much of anybody else, there are mass riots in the cities across the Belgian Congo, where people are just like, we are totally fed up with this. You guys, you won't let us get more than a 6th grade education, and it's hard to do that. And we got to talk to freaking Belgian people about anything we want to do, and all we do is work for you as clerks at best. And the Belgians kind of freak out, and they're like, who knew? People don't like us. What a surprise. And they declare, that's it, fine, we're leaving. And I forget exactly what the timeline is, but it's absolutely absurd that the Belgians say, fine, we're going to hold an election in 6 months. Again, somebody's going to fact check me and point out that I don't know all this stuff off the top of my head. But I think the statistics are something like for 172 seats in the parliament, there are 91 political parties. And
so it was really rushed independence then, where there was not,
and then what happens at that point is that Lumumba is the person with the largest single following in the parliament, and so he manages to get named prime minister as a result. But he's in charge of this mind-bogglingly unwieldy coalition,
of a gigantic country too,
which is also chock full of strategic minerals and resources, and there are also communists and socialists And so it becomes a sort of we're really simplifying this, but it becomes a major focus of Cold War
I
competition.
think we could say it's like getting independence it's like getting your driver's license in the middle of a demolition derby, right?
Thank you. Thank you. Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. Um, and so one of the things that happens is that almost
By,
immediately,
by the way, I had to show my students a clip of Demolition Derby because this is New York. It's not that, it's not that anyone here has seen a Demolition Derby before. So when they saw the clip, they were like, "Oh, that's what he means."
next
Okay.
time you do this, you need to play the song Dirt Track Date
Okay.
by Southern Culture on the Skids.
All right.
It goes perfect with that. Yeah, but what happens again? This is the really fast version. And I may get some of the stuff out of order because did I mention you threw me a curveball on this? But the southern provinces of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, as its name, it's promptly renamed, secede. And those are the regions with the most copper. Those are the regions with the most diamonds. They have a lot of coltan too, but nobody knows what coltan is yet.
Is it that they were encouraged to succeed by the U.S. by
By the
Belgium
Belgians,
by the
by
Belgians?
the Belgians in particular. The United States, I think, and this is another thing where I might be wrong, but I think the United States was hoping that the Democratic Republic of the Congo would stay together because fragmentation offers just that many more sort of opportunities for the Soviet Union to find a window in. Oh, and uranium, by the way. There's the DRC has uranium. The nuclear weapons that were used against Japan were fueled by uranium mined by the Belgians in so
You just cut off for a second. By
oh
uranium mined by the Belgians.
yes, that was the source of the uranium that the United States needed to complete the Manhattan Project. Um, so anyway, so it's an incredibly strategic place. And along the way, the Congolese military revolts because the the Congolese military is still headed by Belgian officers. And so there's a revolt within the military where it demands that all the Belgian officers be removed, and that, Congolese be promoted into the officer corps, which does happen. But it results in people like, I don't know, Mobutu Sese Seko becoming incredibly influential figures in the Belgian Congo as well. And in the really short version of this is that Lumumba, he does not go full Soviet, but he's sort of leaning towards, he's trying to do in many ways probably what Sekou Touré does, where he's trying to play the Soviets against the United States, against each other, to see who will offer up the most resources and support for institution building and infrastructure. But the United States and the Belgians decide that the DRC is just too important to risk. And so both the United States and the Belgians decide that Lumumba needs to die. And it's actually kind of a race to see who can kill him first. There's a really insightful, useful book called The Congo Cables, which is basically just CIA diplomatic and State Department cables that got sued out of the U.S. government under the Freedom of Information Act in the 1970s. So you can read the communications between the State Department and the CIA talking about how are we going to kill Lumumba. Or how come you didn't kill him? Because you were supposed to kill him. And they're like, well, we poisoned his pudding, but he didn't eat the pudding.
Yeah, that happened with Castro too. They tried so many different ways to kill Castro, poison his cigar, and
exactly.
Yeah.
And in the end, the Belgians win the race to kill Lumumba by simply hiring elements of the Congolese army under Mobutu. to arrest him and beat him to death, which is done with the aid of an equivalent of the Belgian Secret Service. I don't know what their secret police are called, but there's a guy who oversees the murder of Patrice Lumumba. And notoriously, when Lumumba is killed, he pulls several of Lumumba's teeth as souvenirs and takes them back to Belgium with him. Those were recently returned just a few years ago to the Democratic Republic of the Congo to be reinterred.
And then Mobutu Sese Seko takes over and is the dictator of the Congo, supported by the U.S., incredibly corrupt during the Cold War.
Mind-bogglingly so.
For the next 30 years or so,
exactly.
Right?
Exactly. Yep, up until 1992.
A kind of cult of personality figure within the Congo, and just everyone. It's a tragic story, and then we'll have to take a look in my class at some current events related to the Congo. It's just a never-ending.
If there's, there are lots of places in the world that are in the running for having been the most cursed over the past 100 or 150 years, but the DRC is definitely in the running.
Yeah. Well, Jonathan, thank you so much. I think we'll stop here. This has just been an incredibly rich discussion. We didn't get to Nigeria, which is your area of expertise. You want to talk? Do you have a couple more minutes? You want to talk Nigeria? Or
let's save that for another time.
Okay, let's save that for another time.
I'm not good at being quick about Nigeria.
That makes sense. And no, this was incredible. I really appreciate your time. This was short notice. And just it's
fun. It's always fun, man. I love doing these. Let's keep it up.
Here, and just getting this breadth of the different countries and how these different pieces fit together, of so many things and happening at the same time over various places, all having different effects on each other. It's great.
It's all connected, man.
All right. Well, thank you.
All right. Thank you. Have a great day. Take care.
Thank you so much to my guests for speaking with me today, to Colin McGrath for the beautiful music that serves as the background to the intro and conclusion, and to all who have listened today. Check out Colin's music on Spotify, his album Window Seat, and some of his new tracks as well. And if you're interested in finding out any more information about my picture books or teaching books, you can look me up at davidsharon.com, and feel free to get in touch with me to let me know what you thought about the podcast. Thank you.